Everyone thinks they know the exact moment their life changes. But for me, it didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or a warning sign. It came quietly, late at night, inside a glass elevator that wasn't supposed to stop. I had always known her as Ms. Kapoor, my boss, the woman whose heels clicked with authority and whose emails arrived precise, sharp, and impossible to ignore. And I had trained myself to keep my emotions tucked neatly behind professionalism whenever she was around. She was brilliant, composed, respected, and completely out of reach. And I told myself that admiration was all it was, nothing more, nothing dangerous. Just the quiet awareness of someone who commanded every room she entered. That night, the office was almost empty, lights dimmed, air heavy with the exhaustion that comes after deadlines. And when she asked if I could stay back to finalize a client presentation, I agreed without hesitation, unaware of how close I was to crossing an invisible line. We worked side by side in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but charged, broken only by keyboard taps and the occasional exchange of focused glances that lingered longer than necessary. When we finally packed up, it was past midnight, the city outside dark and distant, and as we stepped into the elevator together, I felt the familiar instinct to shrink myself, to become just another employee heading home. The doors closed smoothly, the elevator hummed, and for a brief moment, everything felt ordinary, predictable, safe. Then it jolted. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to make my heart jump, followed by a sudden halt that stole the air from my lungs and replaced it with a silence that felt too loud. The lights flickered once, twice, and settled into an uncomfortable dim glow, and when I looked at her, I saw something I had never seen before: uncertainty. She pressed the emergency button, calm but firm, speaking to the operator with a steadiness that surprised me, even as her fingers trembled slightly against the panel. "We're stuck," she said after ending the call, meeting my eyes, and for the first time, she didn't sound like my boss, she sounded human. Minutes stretched, then longer, the air growing warmer, the walls closer, and without the structure of work or hierarchy, the silence began to press in on us. "I hate elevators," she admitted suddenly, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, and the confession caught me off guard because it didn't fit the image I had built of her. I wanted to respond professionally, to keep the boundary intact, but something about being suspended between floors made honesty feel inevitable. "I hate feeling invisible," I said before I could stop myself, the words slipping out like they'd been waiting for permission. She turned toward me fully then, her expression unreadable, and for a moment I worried I had said too much, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Invisible?" she asked gently, and there was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. I nodded, staring at the floor, admitting how hard it was to always be confident, reliable, and unnoticed, how exhausting it felt to exist without being truly seen. She listened, really listened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something fragile beneath the confidence. "Do you know how lonely it is," she said slowly, "to always be the one in charge, to never be allowed to fall apart?" The elevator hummed softly. A reminder that time was moving even though we weren't, and in that suspended space, something shifted between us. We weren't boss and employee anymore, not in that moment. We were just two people sharing truths that had been buried under expectations and titles. I noticed how close we were standing now, close enough to feel her warmth, close enough that my heartbeat felt too loud, and yet neither of us stepped away. Her eyes met mine, searching, vulnerable, and for the first time, I realized how carefully she carried her strength, how heavy it must have been. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything we hadn't said yet, everything waiting just beneath the surface. Somewhere above us, the elevator groaned, a signal that help was coming, and instead of relief, I felt a strange disappointment. Because I knew, standing there with her, that whatever was unfolding between us would change everything, and there would be no pretending it hadn't started. And as the lights flickered again, I understood one undeniable truth. The elevator hadn't just stopped between floors. It had stopped between who we were and who we were about to become. The elevator lurched back into motion with a mechanical sigh, breaking the spell just enough to remind us where we were, and we both stepped back instinctively. Space returning along with the weight of reality. When the doors finally slid open, the hallway lights fell to bright, to normal, and without saying much, we walked out together. Professionalism snapping back into place like armor we both knew how to wear. The ride down in silence should have erased what happened. But it didn't. It followed me home, lingering in my thoughts as I lay awake replaying every word, every look. Every moment where she hadn't been just my boss. The next morning at work, she was Ms. Kapoor again, composed, distant, efficient, and if it weren't for the way her eyes briefly found mine during meetings, I might have convinced myself I imagined the entire thing. But I hadn't, and I could tell she hadn't either, because there was a hesitation now, a softness beneath her authority that hadn't existed before. Days passed like this, charged with something unnamed, our conversations careful, measured, as if both of us were afraid to test what had cracked open in that elevator. I found myself noticing her in ways I tried not to, the tired sigh she let out when she thought no one was watching, the way she lingered at her desk long after others had left. One evening, another deadline loomed, and once again, it was just the two of us in the office, the city dark outside the windows, the hum of computers filling the quiet. She broke the silence first, asking if I wanted coffee, and the question felt heavier than it should have, like an invitation disguised as routine. We sat across from each other in the break room, paper cups warming our hands, and for the first time since the elevator, she didn't rush to fill the space with work talk. I thought about what you said, she admitted, eyes fixed on the cup, about feeling invisible. My chest tightened, because hearing her acknowledge it made it real again, impossible to dismiss. I thought about what you said too, I replied carefully, about never being allowed to fall apart. She looked up then, something unguarded flickering across her face. And I realized how rarely anyone spoke to her like this. I don't get to be unsure, she said quietly, not here, not anywhere. The honesty in her voice dissolved the last of my restraint, and without planning to. I told her how intimidating she'd seemed when I first joined, how inspiring she still was, and how hard it had been to see her as anything other than untouchable. She smiled at that, not the polished smile she used in meetings, but a real one, small and almost shy, and the sight of it made my breath hitch. You don't see me the way everyone else does, she said, more statement than question. No, I admitted. I see someone who's tired of holding everything together. The air between us thickened, the room suddenly feeling smaller, and I became acutely aware of how close she was. How easily I could reach out if I dared. She stood up first, pacing slowly, as if trying to organize her thoughts, and when she stopped in front of me, I felt the shift before it happened. This can't be careless, she said, voice steady but eyes searching. Whatever this is, I know, I replied, my heart racing, but pretending it's nothing feels worse. For a long moment, she didn't respond, and I braced myself for the distance to return, for her to remind me of boundaries and rules. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something she'd carried alone for too long. "I haven't felt seen in a very long time," she said, and that confession landed heavier than any declaration could have. We stood there, close enough that the warmth between us felt undeniable, yet neither of us crossed the final inch. Not yet. Because in that moment, it wasn't about touching, it was about choosing, about deciding whether we were brave enough to let this become something more. And as the office lights flickered overhead, I knew we were standing at the edge of something irreversible, even if neither of us was ready to admit it out loud yet. The next few days stretched tight with restraint, every interaction layered with meaning we refused to name, and it became harder to tell whether the tension was exhausting or exhilarating. Because both of us kept showing up anyway. She avoided the elevator after that, taking the stairs even when deadlines pressed, and I pretended not to notice. Though each avoidance felt like a quiet admission that the moment between floors still lived in her too. Late Friday evening, the office thinned until only our floor remained lit, the city outside glowing like a separate world, and when she stopped by my desk, I sensed the hesitation in the way she said my name. "Walk with me," she asked, not as a command, not as a boss, but as someone asking for company, and I stood without thinking, my heartbeat already outpacing reason. We ended up on the terrace, the night air cool and forgiving, the noise of traffic softened by height, and for the first time in days, neither of us pretended this was about work. "I've been trying to decide what scares me more," she said, resting her hands on the railing, crossing a line, or spending the rest of my life pretending I don't feel things. Her honesty stripped something open in me. And I realized this wasn't a moment asking for permission, but one asking for truth. "I don't want to be a mistake," I said quietly, choosing my words with care, "but I also don't want to be something you regret not exploring." She turned to face me then, really face me, the city lights catching the tired softness in her eyes, and in that instant, she wasn't powerful or distant, she was human. "You wouldn't be a mistake," she said, voice steady but low. "You'd be a risk." I stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't move. Didn't retreat, didn't hide. The space between us felt charged, every unspoken thought humming loud enough to drown out doubt, and when she lifted her hand, brushing her fingers against mine, the contact felt monumental. We didn't rush, didn't collide, didn't let the moment turn into something careless. Instead, we hovered there, close enough to feel breath and warmth and intention. Her eyes searched mine one last time, not for reassurance, but for clarity, and when she found it, her shoulders relaxed like a decision had finally settled. The kiss came gently, unhurried, a soft meeting that carried the weight of restraint and choice, and when our lips touched, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. It wasn't explosive or dramatic, but it was deep, deliberate, filled with everything we had been holding back, and I felt the shift instantly, like something quiet locking into place. She pulled back first, resting her forehead against mine, eyes closed, breathing uneven, and I knew this wasn't confusion anymore, it was acceptance. "That changes things," she whispered, not fearful, not apologetic, just honest. "Yes," I replied, smiling despite the nerves, "but it doesn't ruin them." We stood there longer, the city witnessing something private and fragile, neither of us rushing to label what had just begun. When we finally walked back inside, nothing looked different, but everything felt altered, lighter, and heavier all at once. The following weeks weren't perfect, but they were real, careful conversations, boundaries respected, choices made with intention instead of fear. She stopped being just my boss, and I stopped being just an employee. And somewhere between meetings and quiet glances, something genuine grew. Our first kiss didn't start a scandal or end a career. It simply marked the moment we chose courage over silence. And even now, when I think back on it, I don't remember the elevator, or the rules, or the fear. I remember the calm certainty of choosing to be seen. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives after waiting, after restraint, after two people finally decide not to look away.